welcome everybody. Yay, thanks. We're joined today by Decater Collins, who's here with us. He's moving to Portland soon. He's spent the last 14 years in China, and he's been working on this book, Quitting the Grave. I would show you my copy, but mine's all very loved. And he is a photographer and videographer. He is the producer of Beijing Slice, which you can find on the internet, right? Yes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And also the author of Picasso Painted Dinosaurs and Ahab's Adventures in Wonderland. This is his first full-length novel, Quitting the Grave. So we're going to start with a book reading and an introduction by Decater.
Yeah. So I'm going to read an excerpt, but first I'll give a quick introduction to the book. It starts out in Eugene, Oregon in 1999. There have been 3 grave robberies. In each case, the corpse is a John Doe, and a local reporter starts investigating, and as she investigates, the event surrounding the crime, these grave robberies, gets linked back to 150 years before, when Eugene was first settled and the first pioneers crossed over on the Oregon Trail. So it's 2 parallel stories of like the early pioneers in Oregon and this crime story. So with that, I will.
Do you want to read from this copy or that?
I'll just read from this one.
Okay.
Let's see. I had the page. Yeah, there it is. Yeah. So this is from the opening chapter. Allow me to share a story with you about the forest near my childhood home in McLoughlin, California. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, died in that forest many years ago. Some claimed she'd been murdered. Others that she lost her way and died of exposure. Either way, she has haunted the area ever since. Several years after her death, a passing motorist saw the girl standing inside the cemetery, clutching at the front gate as if desperate to open it. She was wearing a white dress visible through the lingering fog, and her cries could be heard all the way from the road. By the time police arrived, the cemetery was empty. They did, however, discover several bars on the gate bent open and branded by what appeared to be the impressions of small bloody handprints. It will probably seem morbid to you, but I always hoped to meet that girl. I wanted to ask her what it's like to be dead. Is she lonely, or does she have other ghosts to keep her company? Does it feel like she's inside a dream? Would she like to be my friend? For too many years to admit, I've suffered a slow decay. My most essential qualities molder off me like spent ash. My greatest fear is that life will end up as a burnt fuse of random encounters with no inherent meaning in all the suffering we're forced to endure. Anymore, I glide from one tragedy to the next, protected by my objectivity that allows me to be a great journalist, but which keeps me far removed from the people around me. I am unassailable. Not even the consequences of my own misdeeds have the power to touch me. How did I become so disconnected? Was it genetic? That would be the same as saying the only reason Eugene became eccentric and self-absorbed was because of its Northwest geography. Maybe it was my upbringing. My Protestant parents, transplants from the city, raised me half hippie, half determined to take the corporate world by storm. White but female, well off but not rich. A cluttered bag of ethnicities that's left me completely devoid of an identity to claim as my own. I have no way of knowing what happened to that better version of me because I have no idea who I am. I'm a Jane Doe, a victim of amnesia, a ghost of a ghost. Anymore, I only allow people to know a few things about me, and one of them is that I like to spend time in graveyards. I have a history, but it's buried beneath sins best forgotten and choices never made. I'm alive, but what's the point? Yeah.
Thank you. And that passage is from, the book is kind of split up into a historical part, historical fiction, and then we've got our modern day, or kind of modern day tale, 1999, and our main character is Caya, who is a very troubled woman, I guess, and also she is a woman, and so I was wondering what it was like to write a female main character, right from the female perspective.
Yeah, so that was like a decision I made early on, that I wanted the protagonist to be female. It was I put a lot of thought into it because the first thing I had to ask myself, was it right for me as a man to be writing from the perspective of a woman? As you noticed, it's in the first person, and so I did a lot of thought about it, but I decided that that's how I wanted to tell the story, and so I spent a lot of time. Mostly just going up to my female friends and saying, what's it like to be a woman? What's it like in this situation? What's the most mad you've ever been at your boyfriend? What's, just lots and lots and lots of questions, and just took different bits from different places and kind of put it together to come up with this character. And so, and another thing that was really important to me is it's not just the one female character, but it's her and all the women that are surrounding her in her life. So, there's a lot of female characters in there. And
we've got two of the main characters are female.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything that surprised you when you were asking all of your women friends?
It sucks to be a woman sometimes. No, that didn't surprise me. I don't know if anything surprised me. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things. It definitely, not just for the book, for me personally, it was a lot of good conversations that I had about what it's like to be a woman in relationship, what it's like to be a woman in the workplace. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And like you said, there's the two female characters. So there's two situations. There's Caya's situation in 1999, and then there's Helen's situation in the 1840s, which is obviously very different. Yeah.
Did you ask your very old women friends?
So for the historical section, I did a lot of research. So, yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. What did that entail?
Entailed a lot of the internet. That was the first. So I wrote this book about Oregon and Oregon history entirely while I was in China. So that meant a lot of searching on the internet. A lot of books were bought and sent overseas. I spent I went 2 different times to Oregon and did research in archives of the university library, and found and you just go down these rabbit holes where you start researching about you're looking for one thing very, very specifically, what kind of hat would this person be wearing in this situation, and you're looking and looking and looking and looking, and so you're learning all these other things that help, but you can't find what kind of hat he would have. And when you finally find it, you're like, oh my God. So yeah. And then the hard part, this is a very long book, but it was much longer in the first draft, and so then I had to go through, and there's so many of these things that I spent so long researching that's this isn't relevant, and you just have to cut it out, and so then it was wasted effort. But yeah. To
Oregon to promote the book, but you said that you spent your time in China writing it. Why did you not move to Oregon? Would that have not been easier to do the research?
Yeah, I lived in Oregon before. That's why I said it there. I lived there for 3 years. I moved to China, came up with the idea to write this book here, and I wrote it here. The reason I moved to China, the reason I stayed in China, is because I could live here very comfortably, work part-time, spend full-time playing Frisbee for a lot of years, and then still have time to write this book. If I were living in America, I would have had to work full-time, and it just would have been much harder to find the time. So, yeah.
Okay. And speaking of Oregon, you actually went there to do some filming because you are releasing this as an enhanced ebook.
Yeah.
And you had a Kickstarter campaign to help you fund that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I see several people that supported my Kickstarter here, so thank you for that support. The idea behind the Kickstarter was when I read historical fiction, when I watch a movie that's based on a true story, like many of you, I think the first question I ask is, which parts were true, which parts did the author or the writer make up? And so what I decided to do was to produce a series of very short documentaries about the actual history. And to do that, I raised money on Kickstarter. That allowed me to drive the entire length of the Oregon Trail. The characters in the book start out in Fort Wayne, Indiana. So I started out in Fort Wayne, Indiana, drove all the way to Oregon, and along the way interviewed historians, museum curators, National Park Service people about the actual history. And then, and so now when you have the option to buy just the regular ebook, just the story, or you can get the enhanced version of the ebook that's for iPads only, where you not only get the story, but you get 40 videos, 100 plus illustrations and maps. And so as you're reading, or when you finish, you can say, oh, is this guy real? Did this really happen? Did this event occur, or did he make it up? And then you can see what the actual parts are. Yeah, so it's not hard. Anyone can do it, because with the iBooks author app makes it really easy to compile an ebook. But it's also very complicated because, for example, Amazon doesn't allow for video in the Kindle, even the Kindle Fire. So this only works on for now. I'm kind of like predicting that in the future it's going to be widely available, but for now, it's only possible to do this on the iPad, or probably your iPhone too, but that's pretty small. And so, and then it's really complicated because you get, like, Amazon has this very, like, an exclusive program, and you can't release a book. You can only release it on Amazon for the first 90 days, and it's a real pain. And so, yeah, there's a lot of complications behind it. But the actual making of the enhanced ebook was not that difficult. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you did these videos in sort of support of the historical part of the book, and I wanted to ask you how many of these historical events, historical characters are real?
Right. So almost all of the characters in the historical section are actual characters. There's only a few. There's a few in the Fort Wayne, at the very beginning, the Fort Wayne section, that are just ancillary characters that, are just there for support. But almost all of the characters in the Oregon section are real or are based on real characters. There's a few that I kind of co-opted their story, and so I changed their names. But like one of the big early incidents in the Oregon section is this one explorer discovers this trail that combines Northern California to the Willamette Valley, which is Central Oregon. And he was the first white person to discover this trail. But then there's this dispute. Some other explorers said that they found it, and when I was back in Oregon interviewing all these historians, like, they are still debating. They're still, like, fighting each other over who discovered the trail. And it almost I'm really thinking about making a documentary specifically about this trail, and not just the trail itself, because it's maybe not so interesting, but these people that are still, like, arguing, like, and they're so, like, adamant that no, it's this person did it. No, those people are idiots and they're wrong. And then the other people are like, those people are bastards and they're just trying to glorify their ancestors. And so, but I took those characters and I changed their names and kind of made it a different. I just renamed the trail and it so when you're reading it, there's a blending of the actual history and what I've made up. And that's why I made the video, so that you can then watch and see which ones are made up. But most of the characters are real characters.
I think that's really interesting that you talk about how these historians are now arguing over what actually happened, because you do include that in the modern day section of the book as well, that all the historians are arguing over whether or not the Abercrombie trail was discovered by the Abercrombies and the history of the family. So was that inspired by your trips to Oregon?
That's so that kind of made me feel really good, because no, I made that up. I made up the modern, like the feud was still going on. I didn't realize the feud was still going on until I went and interviewed these people, and they were still feuding about it. One of the books I used for my research was by something Applegate, maybe Lori Applegate, Lori Applegate, and she is the granddaughter of one of the Applegate brothers. And in my book, I changed their names. They're the Abercrombie brothers. But she wrote this book based on their diaries, and so she is obviously advocating that they were the ones to discover the trail, and then these other historians are like, no, they're just taking what other people discovered and they gave their name to it. I didn't know that. That's almost exactly what how my story plays out. So, yeah, just luck, I guess. Yeah.
That's interesting. All right, can we have another reading?
This is actually the opening passage of the historical section. It's the chapter entitled, "You Can Tell Everything You Need by Looking in a Man's Eyes." There doesn't need to be an introduction, because this is the introduction. Late in the evening of April 10th, 1828, Jedediah Smith arrived, weary and rain-soaked, at the entrance to Fort Vancouver. When the guards manning the gates hauled Smith inside, they found him feverish and on the point of collapse, with his horse nearly dead from exhaustion. It had been a harrowing ride, but fear for his own life and the life of his wounded comrades left behind had propelled him to the sole point of salvation in the entire region. Dr. Forbes Barkley, the leading medical man at the fort, was called by the sentries and, amidst a series of grumblings and complaints, proclaimed Smith would come through with nothing more serious than a cough. When Smith insisted on speaking with Dr. McLoughlin immediately, it took all of Barkley's persuasive powers to make him agree to a hot meal and a warm bath while the chief factor was informed of his arrival. An American mountain man and trapper working independently in the Oregon country, Jedediah Smith had been away on a scouting mission when the rest of his party was attacked by a hostile tribe of Umpqua Indians. By the time he returned, only 2 of his companies were left alive, both severely wounded. Smith managed his way to Fort Vancouver alone. After the meal and a short rest, Smith was visited by Dr. McLoughlin. Smith found himself slightly unnerved by the doctor's spectral presence. His gaunt 6'4" frame, along with his striking blue eyes and almost skeletal face, tinted McLoughlin something of a fanatic. John McLoughlin had many years ago given up his career as a surgeon to become an administrator in the Hudson Bay Company. As chief factor at Fort Vancouver, he was certainly the most powerful white man in the whole of the Oregon country. Smith related his predicament. The attack came unexpectedly and completely unprovoked. He claimed to have purchased the rights to trap along both the northern and southern forks of the Umpqua River, providing 6.5 pounds of dried pork, 4 head of cattle, and 10 bottles of Kentucky bourbon as payment. But the natives had decided the settlement was not enough and threatened to steal all of the party's furs if more wasn't offered to them. Sensing trouble might be unavoidable, Smith paddled upriver with 2 of his men, looking for a route rumored to lead through the Umpqua Hills into the Willamette Valley. If the pass existed, it would offer swift ingress to the Dalles, an area only a couple hours east of Vancouver. But the way upriver was arduous by paddle, and, when they abandoned their canoes to continue overland, the Umpqua scout who had agreed to show them the way became lost in the maze of hills and valleys. With the search proving hopeless, they returned to their canoes and floated back to camp. As they approached the encampment, None of his men could be seen on shore, and Smith became alarmed. At that moment, an Indian materialized among the trees, yelling something to the guide, who was riding next to Smith in the canoe. The Umpqua snatched Smith's rifle and jumped into the river. The boats immediately fell under a rain of arrows and musket shot. Smith jumped into the water and swam for the opposite shore. The two men in the other canoe paddled furiously, but both received arrow wounds before reaching land. Assuming the rest of his men had fallen victim to a massacre, Smith led his two injured companions into the forest, aiming to put as much distance as possible between themselves and their camp. By the time night fell, it had become clear his friends could not continue on foot. He stole back into the camp and made off with a horse, intending to head for the British settlements to the north. But with no serviceable trail connecting the Umpqua and Willamette valleys, a major reason that although colonies already existed on both the southwest and northwest Pacific coasts, Oregon still lay mostly vacant, Smith was forced to bushwhack through the steep ravines. Having left his remaining supplies with his injured men, he was short of food and ill-prepared to deal with the lingering spring rains. Only a benevolent God made it possible for him to reach his destination. He pleaded with Dr. McLoughlin to send a rescue party. "I've heard the story of Red River. They say you're a man who will lend a hand to a man in dire straits." McLaughlin's most graphic feature was his prematurely white hair. Smith knew the legend. The doctor's hair had lost all its color overnight. Whether true or not, his unnatural hue lent the doctor a phantom aura, especially as his face was haunted by the difficult position Smith's request placed him in. "It's not our place to judge who deserves what, only to help as we can," McLoughlin replied. "As to your request for aid, I will have to think on the matter." With that, he left, Smith, unsatisfied yet exhausted, to sleep. I should say one thing to clear it up. When we're in the book, when we're talking about Vancouver, it's not modern day Vancouver. There's two Vancouvers. There's Vancouver, Washington, which is on this very southern border of Washington State, right across the river from Portland, and Vancouver, Canada. They're both named after the same person, George Vancouver, who was one of the early explorers. But Fort Vancouver was located on the Columbia River, and that was basically, Fort Vancouver was what became Portland. So, yeah.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So that was obviously a section from the historical fiction part of the book. And I wanted to ask you, you have a lot of encounters with Native Americans in the book, although we don't really get a Native American perspective here, but you do have a lot of Native American legends, especially related to Coyote, which is the full name of our main character, Caya, in the modern day section. So I wanted to ask you where you got these legends from. Are they all true Native American legends, or did you make them up?
Right. So, yeah, there is a lot of Native American influence in here. And when I use the word Indian, it's not me using the word Indian, it's the characters in the book using that or whatever other racial slurs they happen to use. Yeah, so there's a lot of, like, if there may be 5 different legends that get recounted about the Coyote. 4 of them are actual Native American legends from different tribes. They're all interesting. The Coyote character is kind of the trickster god or goddess, depending on the story. And there's, so several of them get recounted, but also there's one I made up, and for you guys it'll be maybe interesting because it's I based it on the Journey to the West. So there's a story in there that gets told about a legend of the Coyote. It's really the legend of Monkey, and so Coyote goes on this journey and meets, Pig, and meets these other characters, and I just translated it into a Native American context, but the other legends are all true. Yeah.
Okay. And why did you decide to use those legends?
Well, yeah, I don't want to say too much about that, but the coyote is an important theme, what the coyote represents is an important theme to the book, and one of the characters kind of fulfills that role in the story. And if I say too much about it.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask a little bit more because in the book you talk a lot about how history and memory are linked, and history is written by those who have the capacity to remember, or at least the platform to write down the facts. And you also have this character who is a journalist, and you seem pretty cynical about journalism in America. In the book anyway. She seems quite cynical about journalism. And I wanted to ask how that relates to this idea of history and memory.
Right. So there's two things going on with your question. There's the her cynicism about journalism is more borne out. She has always wanted to be a writer. If you listen to that passage I read, she kind of feels like she's let her life get away from her and it's not going where she wants it to. She settled in her mind, she settled for journalism. And so she has that cynicism about it. And so the book is from her perspective. But yes, the idea of history and the role it plays in the book is obvious. It's historical fiction, or it's half historical fiction. So number one of the themes is history isn't a fact. When you're reading a history book, you're not reading the facts, you're reading one person's version of history. And so I'm very cognizant of that. And in this book, you get many people's versions of history, and by the end you will have seen this story through multiple perspectives, and ultimately it's left to the reader to decide to kind of make their own guess of where the truth lies, and to that end, and one of the reasons I spent so much time researching is because once I did all the research, I then changed some of the facts, one, for myself, for the story, but two, on purpose, there are there are facts that are wrong intentionally, as in this character got it wrong, or they were lying, or they told it wrong, and so that idea, you never know what you can trust in this book, and you never know whether, everyone has their own angle, everyone has their own way of looking at things, and so I took some of those facts and changed them for that reason.
The publishing of this book, you've chosen to self-publish, and I wanted to ask how that works and why you chose to do that.
Right. So everyone likes to ask me, I don't know if they but they're like, oh, you have a book, that's great, who's publishing it? And I say, oh, I'm publishing it myself, and it's always like, oh. I spent a lot of time researching whether I should publish it myself, whether I should try to find a publisher, and anyone who's been, kind of hip to technology in the last 10 years knows that industries are dying. It started with the music industry, it's happening to the movie industry, and it's starting to happen to the publishing industry. Piracy is killing these legacy industries, and specifically for music and for books, it's becoming so cheap to do it yourself that authors and musicians are asking, why do we need this middleman to take money out of our pocket to distribute it when I can just go put something up on YouTube or put something up on iBooks, or use my social media to get it. What I found during my research, besides what everyone already knows about these industries, is that if you go to a publisher, their first question for you isn't like, oh, is the book any good? Their first question is, how are you going to market it? Who are you marketing it to? Who's your audience? You know, how many followers do you have on social media? They're asking you for your marketing plan. Where I'm like, well, I'm coming to you so you can market it. I did the writing. It's your job to market it, but it's not how it works anymore. Like the majority of books that are getting made are by obviously famous, well-known authors, but also just famous people. Like if you are someone famous because you're a politician, because you're a movie star, because you landed an airplane in the Hudson River, they say, oh, you know, this guy, let's give him some money to write a book. But for new authors, it's getting harder and harder to break in because the returns are so low for them. And so for me, once I did all this research, it was like, oh, why would I get in bed with these people that aren't really on my side? And so I made this decision to self-publish. I know that it's going to be much harder in the beginning, but this is my career. This is what I want to do with my life, and so I'm in it 100%. And so it's just like one step at a time, and that's why I did the Kickstarter. It's why I'm moving back to Oregon to promote it. And one more thing I want to say about this is I think it's really fascinating to me that if you are an indie musician, if you're in an indie band and you have all these followers and they love you, and then you get signed by a major label, everyone's, oh, they sold out. You know, they were real before, and now they're just, you know, they've gone commercial, and so all their original fans leave them. But with authors, it's the exact opposite. If you are not associated with one of the big publishers, or at least a smaller publishing house, you're viewed as not being legitimate. And I've just been giving this a lot of thought. Why is this? Why is there this different expectation of musicians than there is for authors? And what I came up with is it's an issue of discoverability. When you are presented with a new band, like they have a new song or they have a new video, you can digest it in 5 minutes or less. And you can make your decision immediately. Yes, this is something I like, or no, this is not something I like. But with a book, all you have is the cover and the quotes on the back, because it's a much bigger endeavor to read an entire book. And so I think that issue of discoverability is what makes it challenging for an independent author. And I think for an independent author, that for me, that's what I am number one concerned about, is legitimacy. How can I present myself in a way that I am not just writing some fan fiction about Twilight? Yeah. Oh, well, I wrote a book about supernatural elements in the Northwest, so. My book has this book, one of the focuses was, I started this book more than 10 years ago. And in that time, I've published 2 other books. Because when this came out, for this not to be my first book, I wanted that if someone saw, oh, what's this book? Oh, it's got an interesting title. Who is this guy? Oh, he doesn't have any other books. And it's independently published. Forget it. No, that's why I wanted to have these 2 other books already out, to do, you know, the Kickstarter, and to do my website, and to do a lot of other things, so that I already have at least something of a presence, so that when people hopefully discover this book, they'll say, oh, this is an author. It's not just someone just starting out. Yeah. Plus, it has a really strong regional focus on Oregon, obviously, and so that's why I'm going to Oregon. Yeah.
Great. I want to open the questions up to the audience now. If anybody has any questions you want to ask. Liz.
tell me, how did you go about writing the dual timeline? I mean, did you write it as we read it in the book, or did you do one story and then another and then try to mesh it together? How did you do that? How do you keep it straight in your head?
Right. So before I write anything, I outline everything from the beginning, and so I carefully outlined everything that was going to happen, and I kind of knew how it was going to end. And I knew like a few key moments in the middle, and I knew how it was going to end, and I worked backwards, and just outlined how it was all going to fit together. And dust storm, yeah, I'm not going to miss that. And so when I was writing originally. And it's interesting that you asked. Originally, it wasn't chapter by chapter going back and forth. It was originally episode by episode. And so one chapter might have 10 episodes, and it would go literally one episode to the next and back and forth and back and forth. So it was very jarring. And that's my initial proofreaders, my beta readers, they really got hung up on how they would just be starting to get involved in one story, like it might be 5 pages and something's about to happen, and then, now we're going back 150 years again. And so I took, their feedback and realized that's probably too jarring, and so now I do it chapter by chapter. So I reorganized it, and then I had to because I had very carefully planned out so that each one of those chapters would end on a high note, and it would build from one story to the next, and they paralleled each other just right. And so then when I meshed them back together chapter by chapter, I had to again go through and kind of reorganize so that those climaxes would happen at just the right point in both stories again. I had finished writing the book when I started interviewing these people. And so some of them I gave the book to. Speaking about the historians, number one, I forgot to mention, even though the videos are intended for the enhanced version, they're also all online. You can watch them all, for free online. It's just that it's obviously, different experience to have it right in front of you on your iPad and just be able to click on a video, or have to go and look it up on YouTube or whatever. I met a lot of really interesting people, and some of them are pretty crazy. The one video, I talked to this one guy. His name is Doug Card. He was a sociology professor at University of Oregon, and he just was obsessed by this time period very specifically that I researched. And so when I came to him and said, all these other people have said, you're the guy to talk to about this. And he just was so thrilled. He's retired now, he's in his 70s. And he's like, no one else is interested in this stuff. And he's like, how did you find out about this event? I'm like, I just found it online. He's like, that's online? Like, I thought the only place that was in the book I wrote about it that no one's ever read. And so he felt this, on the one hand, he felt this great affinity for me because I was interested in this thing that very few people are really interested in. Because it's not just about Oregon history. These characters that are in this book are super obscure. Like Dr. McLoughlin, the one that was mentioned before, he was the one that founded Fort Vancouver. He's considered the father of Oregon. So, not everyone, but many people in Oregon know about him. But all these other subsidiary characters that were living at Fort Vancouver at the time, no one knows anything about them. And so on the one hand, he's so interested, but on the other hand, he was like, if I made just the minutest mistake, he was like, no, that's not how it is at all. I'm like, oh. And it was really intimidating. And he was like, so I'm sure about how this trail is like, if you go 3 kilometers over there, you can still see where, Alexander McLeod wrote in his diary about this, stump that was there, and you can still see the stump. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know anything about the stump. And I felt this tremendous pressure, and I gave him my book, and I hope he hasn't read it, because I know he's going to hate it.
You don't say that to anybody else.
Because I tried to emphasize, I was like, this is historical fiction. This is why I'm coming to you for these documentaries, to say this is the real part. It's different from my version, which is for entertainment. But yeah, so as a writer, I've known I wanted to be a writer. I started writing my first novel in 5th grade. I got 3 pages in and then dropped it, and then but then I still have these notebooks. I started writing this story. I was in 5th grade. I wrote a few pages, went on to play with my Star Wars toys or something, and then the next summer I was like, oh, I want to write that novel again. And so I was like, oh, this is terrible. And so I'd start again. I have 5 different versions of that. And each time you can just see oh yeah, I'm a much better writer. I'm a much better writer. I'm a much better writer. And so for this book, lots of people ask me, where did you get the idea? And I say, I can't tell you where I got the idea, because if I tell you the idea, I'm basically giving away the ending. Because I had this idea, it just popped into my head, this image and the name of the book. And I was like, oh, that's a cool name. And I was like, oh, that could be something. Now I have these ideas every time I take a shower, every time I ride my bike, I have, oh, that's a good idea. I have notebooks and notebooks and notebooks of, oh, this would be a good novel, this would be a good short story, this would be a good movie. And so it's a really good question, because I had just having that idea doesn't mean anything with me. But I started oh yeah, this is good. And so I started to think about it more. I started to write down notes. I'm like, so there's not one moment where it just oh yes, this is really happening, but it just momentum slowly built. And so to tie this back into my first story, I'm still working on that novel I started in 5th grade. And I've been working on it my whole life, and I was working on it then, and I came up with this idea, and I just oh, this is a good idea. And the thing that made me want to pause with the other novel and write this one first was this idea was much more commercial than my other idea. And I know that anyone that's read it, it's more commercial than the 650-page historical novel without quotation marks. And yes, this is much more commercial than my other idea. And so I just was yes, I want to write this, and I just committed to it. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of ex-girlfriends in Caya, and I say that plural. There's I took a lot of elements of different ex-girlfriends and put it into Caya, and then there's a lot of me in there too. And so then it was just mixing that together to come up with this idea of the character. And then, like I said earlier, talking to a lot of my female friends and asking them about their experience, and just trying. So the character was easy for me to come up with. What was hard was the voice, and so that was, so talking to a lot of my friends helped, but in particular, reading 2 authors really helped inform me. Margaret Atwood and an Australian author that you probably haven't heard of, Nikki Jamel. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. And so they write, they both write without using quotations, and they both write in a very poetic style. And so I kind of tried to like mix in their voices with my voice and with the ideas that this character is based around. Yeah. Yes. So that was this one was my second successful campaign. I did the first one specifically just to see. I asked for a very low amount just as a test for this one. And so doing that taught me a lot. I made a lot of mistakes, and if it hadn't been for such a small amount, I never would have reached my goal. But that taught me a lot. And so then when I did the second one, I was also successful, but I also made a lot of mistakes that I wish to have back. I think number one is research. Like, research the hell out of Kickstarter, research the hell out of whatever field that you're focused on. If you're focused on independent publishing, then find out what other people have done in that area that were successful and unsuccessful, and look at all the data about Kickstarter and Indiegogo. You can't know enough. You just get as much information as you can. Number two, and this is one of the mistakes I made, is make the best video you can, because that's a big part. And so when I was looking at the like people like the self-publishing section of Kickstarter, there's a lot of guys in front of their computer, just talking to the camera, no editing, no production value, and they were successful, and they were just saying, this is what I've always wanted to do. And it was very sincere and very direct, and I was like, well, this seems to be the formula. If you look in like the product categories or the movie categories, then the films are very slick and professionally done. But I was like, well, maybe this kind of like just simple, sincere video is the way to go. And that was a mistake. I should have made the best video I can, especially since what I was raising money for wasn't just for publishing the book, but for making these videos. And I had the ability to make a better video than I did. And because the number one thing you can do to be successful on Kickstarter is to get Kickstarter to feature your campaign. And the best way to get your campaign featured is to have a kick-ass video. And then there's lots of other small things that you can do. I have a 8-part blog post on it's 8 parts, but the 7 essential things you need to do to succeed at a Kickstarter campaign. So there's lots of information.
Yes, Liz.
Without giving everything away, how did you edit yourself with regards to the supernatural elements of the story, so that you weren't going off down an obvious track or a stereotypical track?
I don't know about stereotypical, but the obvious, like, when I finished and I was looking at it, I was like, this is so obvious what's going to happen. It's so transparent. And I'm like, how can, like, it's like you see it coming from miles away. And so far, most people that have read it have been completely caught off guard by the ending. And so I was like, okay, it wasn't too obvious. Because if you reread it, there's one of the things I'm most proud of is this is not a one-time read. Like, if you read it a second time, it's like a completely different novel. And so you should buy 2 copies. But yeah, because when you reread it, you're like, oh, yes, oh, yeah, oh, I see, this is going in this direction all along. But I just like tried to cover it up as much as possible to not make it too obvious. I mean, the stereotypical part, I just had this idea, it's my idea, maybe other people would have an idea that's similar. I saw a movie that had a very similar idea after I was 6 years in, and I was like, because I read the synopsis of this movie, and I was like, oh no. And then I watched the movie, it was completely different, the same theme, but completely different take on it. So I was like, okay. So I think that it's my idea. Yeah. So if it's cliche or stereotypical, I can't speak to that, but it's just what I wanted to write about. Thanks.
Yeah, congratulations. And good luck in Portland.
Mm-hmm.
You can where can we buy Quitting the Grave?
Yeah, so right now, because of Amazon and Apple's fight over who gets to control content, it's only available on Amazon for right now. You can just do a search for Quitting the Grave. It'll be the first thing that comes up. But it's 90 days exclusive to Amazon, and so at the end of 90 days, which will be another 6 weeks probably, I can't remember exactly, it will then also be available in the enhanced version will be available in the Apple iTunes, iBook store. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks,
Yeah.
Decater. And now we can start the roast.
Yeah, well, yeah. I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you to the Bookworm for hosting. I really appreciate it. Yeah.